Act 2 Chapter 20, all according to plan. A forest in the southwestern border near Darat, 338 solar year. Razi and the last surviving members of his Nagara military escort were fleeing for their lives through the forest near Darat. Much to their surprise, they had made it out of the city alive. Now if they could just make it past this military garrison and then over the bridge at Port Spinax into the wilder and untamed areas of the country, they might have a real chance to make it out of the Quendam and back to the safety of their own borders. It was not in Razi's nature to retreat or run from a fight. Normally, his pride and conceited attitude would never allow it. But, with about 50 men from the Royal Guard, 2 Queen's Knights, and that warrior from the island nations hot on his trail, this was not the time for such reckless youthful indiscretions. One of the 4 remaining escorts tripped over a log. The loud smack of flesh and bone impacting the ground reverberated all around them. Razi and the other 3 came to a quick stop. They were all breathing hard by this point. Moreover, when they turned around to see their fallen comrade on the ground grasping his leg and yelling in pain, it quickly became clear to them all that at best he had twisted his ankle or at worst had broken it. There is no way he'll be able to run now with his leg like that. One of the Nagarian escorts said. We could try and carry him out, suggested another one. We can't. That would only slow us down, and those queen-loving dogs are nipping right on our heels, added the third. They looked at the young priest and asked, What should we do, Master Razi? Razi looked at them. Looking at him, they appeared as though this question had no easy solution. For him, this answer wasn't complicated or a moral dilemma at all. He walked over slowly to the injured man and unsheathed his sword. And with one swipe from his sharp blade, the injured man was yelling in pain no longer. The first 2 escorts looked utterly speechless and disgusted. The third and more pragmatic of the Nagarian soldiers was clearly mad as the other 2, but not surprised by this logical action. Razi pointed his blade at the 3 men and said hoarsely as he was still out of breath from all their running, If you don't want to end up like your little friend here or worse, end up rotting in Agat prison if those knights catch us, then shut up and start moving. Plus, for goodness sake, don't trip over anything. Now let's go. With that, the now party of 4 were on the run once again, leaving their dead comrade on the forest path. Nyoka entered the Nagarian council chambers. The room was large and shaped like a giant pentagram. The place was made of oak and several exquisite paintings lined the walls depicting the nation's brief and mysterious history. In the center of the room there was a large round table with 3 of the 4 chairs around it occupied by a few important-looking people. These 3 men were dressed in the finest robes. Several gold jewels and other precious stones adorned their vestments. These 3 along with Nyoka made up the Grand High Priests. Together this quartet were the ruling voice in the Order of Tessers. This extremist occult organization governed over the whole nation of Nagara. Geographically their nation was small, but as the Quendam had come to learn in the last war, one must never underestimate these religious fanatics. But now Nyoka had called this mysterious and sudden council meeting, and the other 3 were not pleased in the slightest about it. Why have you convened this meeting on such a short notice and so early? Shouldn't you be on your way to Falena for your monthly inspection of their military? Asked the first Grand Priest as haughtiness came pouring out of his mouth like water gushing from a spring. Despite the venom in his tone, Nyoka took his empty seat and said not a word. The other 2 members watched him in silence, expecting him to speak. When the uncomfortable stillness had finally overtaken them, another of the 4 spoke up too. As much as I love listening to your cryptic old way of speaking and cold silent stares you make when you're not speaking, Nyoka, I've got better things to do with my day. The temple taxes are due next week and there is gold to count and potch to make. As he stood up to leave, Nyoka extended his right hand as shots of blue lightning poured forth, shocking the outspoken chief clergyman. The other high priests stood up, weapons at the ready, and demanded Nyoka stop. Nyoka remained sitting. His emotionless expression never changed, but he did cease. The other 2 ran to check on their comrade. He was still alive for the moment. Lord Nyoka, What is the meaning of this? Who do you think you are? The haughty one demanded. At last, Nyoka rose to his feet. His pale docile expression remained unchanged, but a cold empty sound like words from his mouth poured out. I say unto thee, I am thy death. Our death? I think not. You're mad if you think you can murder all of us and get away with it. This palace is crawling with guards, they will stop you. Ha ha ha, he bellowed in a terrifying way that sent shivers running down the spines of all three of the priestly rulers. Then, the Dark Lord added, my plans are centuries in the making. When thou art dead, these lands shall fall into a bloody civil war, and I shalt have none to standeth in my way. I shalt attack Falena and retrieve the Sun Rune at last. Coughing first and then speaking, 3 Grand High Priests dead. The 4th missing. You don't think that someone will suspect you? Are you that dull? Or has your arrogance blinded you too, you fool? Said the 3rd cleric, who had been electrocuted, but now had recovered enough and was on his feet again. The Dark Cleric now looked upon them with a sinister glee. He waved his hand and one of the lifeless clone bodies his soul normally enwelled appeared on the table. Shaking his head back and forth to indicate the word no, he said, Thou art thy foolish ones. For I too shalt, also, be dead. Or at least, those churls beyond these walls, shalt thinketh so. With that the symbol of the half-moon rune appeared above the old priest's head and rays of dark light poured forth. Blood-curdling screams and horrific shouts echoed throughout the council chambers. One begged for mercy and the other 2 pleaded for a quicker death. Several moments later the dead corpses of all 4 Grand High Priests of Nagara were littered across the large round table as Nyoka walked out a back door then teleported away. Phase 2 was over. Now if his servant did his job right, Phase 3 of his master plan would soon be in place. Then, the war for the Sun Rune would begin anew for him. A large number of Falanin troops and Queen's knights were riding on horseback through the forest catching up to their would-be prey. A number of knights were on foot as well and several of them had tracking dogs. They had found their scent and it would only be a matter of time before they caught up to them now. A scout came galloping up to the front of the pack, where Robert, Gress, and Laszlo were riding with their eyes piercing out over the distance looking in between the trees for any unusual movement. The scout came alongside Gress and reported, Sir, we've received a dispatch from Durat. They got word from Sir Marcus and are sending out scouting parties as well. In addition, they gave notice to Port Spinax as well. The entire place has been put on total lockdown. Guards are on both sides of the bridge and they're not letting any ship in or out of port until you give them word, sir. They won't be able to escape the country now. Don't underestimate them. A clearly annoyed and injured Robert added, more bridge guards or not, they are still very dangerous and shouldn't be taken so lightly. Now get back to the hunt. At the strength in his words of warning, the scout couldn't help but notice Robert's left arm. It had been wrapped in a slightly crimson-stained, but otherwise white bandage. It was clear to him that this dark spot was dry blood from a fresh and recent wound. Robert looked at the man with an expression of pure irritation that clearly told the man to get lost. With that, the scout went off to check on the progress of the tracking dogs. Hell of a way to spend the first week of your nation's new year, eh, Laszlo? Grass spoke up, trying to bring some calm back to this still tense situation with his older brother. Laszlo, quickly picking up on the point of the small talk, replied, well, I can honestly say this was not as boring as last New Year's. I was just traveling alone through the grasslands on the northern continent then. It was pretty dull compared to this. Well, I am glad we can entertain you this time around, Ambassador, added the grouchy halberd master. Vexed by his words, the swordsman retorted, Robert, that is enough. You lost the fight. But, it's not your fault he got away. Plus, that's no reason to be disrespectful toward Master Laszlo. Robert said nothing. He knew his brother was right. In truth, he had more respect for Laszlo and his prodigious abilities than probably any man he had ever met, say his own father and brother. But none of that mattered now, as his pride had been wounded far more than his arm had been. He pulled the reins left and the horse moved in that direction. Apparently, Robert, also, wanted to go check on the progress of the bloodhounds with their owners for any new information. Don't take it personally, Sir Laszlo. Robert doesn't take losing a fight very well. Especially, after all this. Laszlo said in a rather matter-of-fact sort of way, I don't take it personally. It's not in his nature to accept defeat. His honor means too much to him. I understand that fact perfectly. I am sure once we get this guy, he'll calm down a bit. Well, as calm as he gets anyway. Grass looked over at Laszlo as small grins overtook both their faces. Suddenly, there was a shout. A random voice called out, Sirs, the dogs. They found something. Come quick. Oh, my. It's a body. Robert was the first one there as he had already been heading in that direction anyhow. The others soon arrived. Sure enough, there was a dead Nagarian soldier laid out before them. Robert bent down to examine the sword wound across the man's chest. Afterwards, he said calmly, the strike was swift and clean. Professional. It came from a Nagarian blade, of that much I am certain. Laszlo then stated, so, it was probably this Razi guy, then? Robert nodded in agreement at this conclusion. One of the Royal Guard captains spoke up in disgust, those fanatical cultic drones. Turning their weapons on their own men. Barbarians. Grass then pointed to the man's leg. He still had only been dead a short time and his leg still had swelling and bruising on it. Then, he gestured to the log beside the group saying, he must have tripped and broke his leg. Rather than being slowed down by their injured companion or risk him getting captured by us, they killed him. Razi must have figured this was the simplest thing to do given their circumstances. A new wave of revulsion came over the nearby troops in earshot. One could be heard saying, those cowards. Another added, turning their back on one of their own. I know. If this is how they treat their friends, makes you wonder how they treat their foes. How is the Queen supposed to make peace with ravenous dogs like these? Replied the first loud soldier. Robert and Grass made eye contact as though to ask each other the same question, only without words. Then, Grass yelled out, they have to be close. The body is still warm. Maybe only an hour or so ahead of us. He turned toward the bloodhound handlers. Have the dogs start looking for the scent of this guy's blood. I doubt Razi had time to clean the blood off his sword. Sir, yes, sir. Replied the knights who handled the canines. Within moments the whole posse was back on the trail of their fugitives. As they were riding, Laszlo couldn't help but reflect on the day. Just earlier this morning he had been sitting with Tanya and Desmond having breakfast at East Palace, listening to them argue about the most mundane things. Grass had been thinking about the same, as how quickly his day had changed since his night's meeting this morning. Now they were fresh on the trail of the man who had been the source of all their trouble, since Laszlo and his friends arrived in this land all those months ago, or so they thought. They had just returned from their summer vacation in Yashunar village and the peace treaty was now at center stage again. However, before the talks began anew, they did manage to celebrate the new year on the solar year calendar. Though created by Holy Harmonia, this system of timekeeping was used by much of the known world. Moreover, the year 338 was looking more promising than the previous one, on that they all agreed. Tanya and Desmond were sitting at the breakfast table as Laszlo entered and sat down beside them. As Laszlo was reaching for the jam for his toast, he saw that Tanya was penning a draft for something that looked official. Is that for the final peace agreement meeting we're having today? She replied, no, I finished those documents last night. This is for something else. A personal pursuit. Nothing to worry about, Laszlo. Oh, is that so? Said Desmond skeptically, but curiously. He stood up and bent over the table to get a better look at the parchment. Tanya rolled it up like a scroll. Then redirecting the conversation, she noted, this will be the last of the official meetings before the final signature signing next month. Yet, we still have a few key issues to work out still. Let's do our best today, alright? The Queen's meeting should be over soon, So, we should be heading to the capital for this last meeting ourselves. They consented. Thus, afterwards they were off for Sulphalena in a carriage that had been arranged for them. Meanwhile, that morning a very special and serious royal meeting was being held. Even Elamark, herself, was present at this meeting given its severity. Godwin said, "My lord, I am sorry. But, you did say you wanted me to investigate the matter quietly and go wherever the evidence pointed me. No matter who it took me to. While I agree, my associate's actions were not completely legal. However, he had a hunch that the rumors he heard might be correct. That's why he privately investigated Ethelbald Manor. When he did, he found this evidence in Master Emerate's room. He returned to me and told me what he found." Laying the paper on the table, he added, "As a Queen's Knight and Princess Syra's husband, I was within my legal right to search the mansion under probable cause. I gathered our local guards and went to the house myself. Sure enough, they were there just as my informant told me." Marcus gestured toward the table and to the 12 open letters that proved Emirates was corresponding with someone high up in the Nagarian government about kidnapping Princess Elinda as well as devising plans for stopping the negotiations between the island nations and Falena. He re-emphasized his previous words, "Again, I was only following your orders, my lord. You wanted the truth no matter what, and I have. I used my contacts and power as a Queen's Knight. Damn it, man, I know it was within your power, but that's not the issue. It's just, I never would have imagined my nephew. I mean, I know the boy was a bit odd. But, to do all this. It's sedition. It's treason," interrupted Dalen with a rather rough and hoarse tone. "They're already talking about this in the Senate. Saying I am too old and that I should have seen this coming. They'll say, he can't keep his own family in check, how then can he rule a nation? My entire reputation and family name ruined just like that." He snapped his fingers. Said Dalen with melancholy. "Sir," interrupted Gress, "you must not blame yourself. Not you or anyone else could have seen this coming. Everyone thought your nephew was crazy. I mean, the boy was caught talking to trees and playing in the sewers how many times? He fooled everyone. Pretending to be mad, all while plotting behind the Queen's back to destroy this nation, all for his own personal greed." Aelin sighed softly to himself and Elamark reached her hand to his as a show of comfort. At this point, Rose interjected, "Where is the traitorous little noble now?" "He is being held in Nagant prison awaiting his trial in 2 weeks," replied Gress. Wanting to move on to a new topic, Elamark said, "Is there any other business to discuss this morning, please?" Robert spoke up, "Our favorite ambassador from Nagara, rather his little stooge, should be arriving this morning for another weapons inspection, your grace." The Queen asked curiously, "Again, no Ambassador Nyoka? This will be the 3rd weapons inspection he has missed in a row. Where is he? What does his attendant say?" The commander had placed escorting the Nagarian officials under Gress's careful watch, ever since he had reassigned Robert to head up the security of the trade talks at East Palace. Thus, the swordsman replied, "My queen, last month the boy told me his master was ill. The time before that, he said his lord was pressed by official business in his nation's capital. Just excuses. Each seemed as flimsy as the next. Suspicious. I did a little reconnaissance work, but I still couldn't prove anything for certain." "I see," spoke the Queen softly. "Speaking of which, I should be heading to the port now to await our favorite little shady zealot. That is if you no longer need me, your highness," added the cunning knight. However, Aelin shook his head no, saying, "Robert, you go in his stead. I have another mission for you, Gress." The brothers looked at each other with puzzlement, but obeyed their commander's orders. After he left, the Queen spoke on, "My other main reason for attending this meeting has to do with our treaty with the Island Nations Federation and Amos Barrows. As you know, it has been agreed that in order to ensure peace and steady commerce between our 2 nations, the island ambassadors have suggested a midpoint stopping port. Since no natural port exists, we'll need to create one. Lady Danya was kind enough to suggest the island of Niva. This isle is about halfway between our two nations. It is a small quarry and several forest areas. So, constructing a small port town and probably some sort of lighthouse would be easy enough. Elimark paused a moment, took a deep breath, and continued. The only real two issues are finding the money to build it and maintaining a military force to protect it from pirates and just general maintenance. Now the Federation has offered to patrol this new colony city and even handle its upkeep, but they want us to pay for its construction. Given the costs of the last war and current rebuilding projects throughout the nation, the royal coffers are nearly depleted. That's why we need this trade agreement with the island nations. However, we don't have the money for such an expensive endeavor. This is where Amos Barrows comes in. He has offered to pay for the building of the colony on the condition that he and... She couldn't finish this last part without stumbling over her words. That he and Princess Alinda are to be married. Yelled an interrupting Rose, it's just awful. You can't do it, Your Majesty. You just can't marry the precious princess off to that foolish tall oaf. Alinda thought the whole thing was a joke until I showed her the letter he sent to you, Your Grace. Then, she locked herself in her room and began crying for over an hour. He's a horrible, horrible man. It's just not fair. A princess for a port and lighthouse. It's just not fair. After a few more moments of going on like this, Alan lifted a hand and she stopped talking. Alan spoke in his old reserved voice again. I thought I would owe Barrows an apology for accusing his family of conspiring to stop the peace talks by throwing fire and rocks. But, it appears now that was all a set-up by my treacherous nephew to throw us off the trail. I guess a simple I am sorry won't do. He wants far more than this old fool's request for forgiveness. He wants this old fool's daughter as well. Syra, who normally never attended such meetings, spoke up at last. She said, Alinda and I are both princesses of this nation, just as you were once, mother. And you have taught us that the needs of the queendom must always come first, even before our own wants. Alinda will see this soon enough. She is a smart girl. The old warrior poet now interjected again, your mother and I will discuss Lord Barrows's offer privately and then later on today with Alinda. For now, on to the last piece of business for the day. Grace, what did you learn about all these reports and rumors I've heard about grave robbers terrorizing small town cemeteries in the western half of our country? Before he could answer there was an urgent knock on the door. A young military officer came bouncing in the room, red-faced and out of breath. Taking in a heavy breath, he tried talking, but couldn't yet speak. At last, he got enough wind, and started bowing. He asked for forgiveness for disrupting such an important meeting. Growing impatient, Godwin spoke up rudely, what is it already, Major? Taking the hint, the Major said, a rider from Nagara just arrived. He has an urgent message for the Queen. He was now holding out a document rolled up like a scroll and it had the official wax seal of the Nagarian Grand Council. Yes, we know, said Alan, Lord Nyoka's servant and a few escorts are arriving this morning. Did they bring this message? No, milord. This messenger came on horse, not ship, and alone. I don't think he had anything to do with the ambassador's party, responded the officer. Alan took the message and read it. A look of shock overtook his face. He passed the note to his wife. After the Queen absorbed all its contents, she too was flabbergasted. What is it? Asked everyone else almost in unison. Alan explained, the boy, Razi, supposedly he has been plotting something behind his master's back. Apparently, according to this, a few high-ranking officials in their government were surprised by Nyoka's frequent absences in recent months. They sent soldiers to his house 5 days ago only to find Nyoka locked in the dungeon of his own home. He said that Razi had locked him in there as he wanted to be the master and not the slave anymore. The young priest was trying to situate himself into taking Nyoka's religious power and high position. In addition, they believe that he was corresponding with someone in this nation to plot a royal kidnapping and interfere with this country's foreign politics. he finished. Everyone's eyes looked down at the letters found in the Ethelbalds' home. It all made sense now. There, truth, had been in front of them all this time. Though it was now just hard to believe. Aelin quickly came out of his daze and said, "Major, gather all the troops in the palace now. Meet me and the Queen's knights near the main gate in front of the armory on the double. This little bastard is done making fools of us. My dear, you need to write a letter to the Nagarian pontiffs informing them of all we have learned today. But, don't send it until we have Razi in custody. No point in making ourselves seem any more foolish or weak to our enemies than we must." Within moments everyone had their tasks and were out the door. Gress decided he would go to the courtyard first. Aelin agreed to check the harbour and Rose went to watch the armory. They all agreed to meet back at the main palace gate if they didn't find them. They knew that Razi and Robert would have to go through that gate eventually wherever they were now. "Where is your master this time, boy?" asked a sarcastic Robert. Razi retorted, "My liege, unlike you, is a very important man and has many important responsibilities. You, however, are not that important. That is why he is not here. Thus, he left me in charge to inspect your nation's armaments." The annoyed Queen's Knight countered, "So, by that logic, you must not be very important either? As your master sent you to do this rather unimportant thing, eh?" The young swordsman said nothing, but just silently scoffed at him. Razi had 10 escorts with him. Thus, they and Robert as well as a few of the palace guards led them to the armory as they had done several times before. As they came out of the building, they saw Laszlo, Danya, and Desmond entering the castle grounds through the main gate. The trio made their way toward Robert and the others. They were still some distance away, when they saw Rose come running around the corner yelling at them, "Stop them! They're liars! Arrest the Nagarians!" Robert spun around on his heel, his weapon nearly at the ready, but was too late. A shining streaking of light came thrusting straight at him. It was Razi's sword. The blade cut right through his knight's uniform with ease and sliced the edge of his bicep. Had his blade been 2 more inches to the right, he could have taken half the man's arm off. Robert dropped his weapon as pain surged through his arm like a raging fire. He used his free arm to grab his wounded one in order to try and stop the bleeding out of pure instinct and not forethought. Next, Razi lifted his weapon and was about to again strike the fallen knight. As the sword came down, Rose leapt in the way between them. She had both hands on either end of one of her ivory-handled nunchucks. The chain that was connecting each piece of ivory caught the sword in midair as the blade was coming downward upon Robert. The sound of sword clanging upon metal chain distracted the cleric long enough to allow Rose to raise her knee right into the man's gut. He recoiled back, clutching his stomach and dropping his sword. The temporary stalemate had been broken. Some of the escorts quickly gathered around their fallen charge. Laszlo, seeing what was going on, put himself between his 2 political peers and drew his weapons and assumed a defensive posture. He wasn't sure what was happening and figured it'd be more prudent to wait unless he was needed. For now, he reasoned he would just protect his 2 old friends. Quickly more palace troops appeared as well as Aelin and Gress. Knowing they could not escape back to their ship, Razi knew their only chance to escape now rested in using the side entrance that led into the city square. He grabbed his sword and started fighting to the side gate. Killing a few palace guards that blocked them, they got through and started running into the crowded marketplace. Some palace archers had managed to kill several of Razi's escort that were using their bodies as human shields to allow him to escape. Soon 6 of his 10 escort troops were dead. "Hold your arrows, men," ordered Aelin, "we don't want to hit any civilians." The archers relaxed their bows. Gress and several infantrymen took to the city streets to give chase to the remaining fugitives. "Are you hurt?" asked a concerned Rose. "I'll be fine," an angry Robert said. "Mind telling me what in the name of the sun was that all about?" Rose brought Robert and the 3 islanders up to speed on what was going on as the royal family doctor patched the halberd master up right there on the street. Since, He refused to leave until he knew what was going on. About 40 minutes later, Gress and the others returned from the city. The Nagarians had apparently given them the slip. They had run to the edge of town, jumped into the Faetuus River and swam beyond the city's walls. Now they seemed to be heading southwest toward Durat, and ultimately Nagara. Aelin had been planning for this. From the time Gress took chase into the city, the old commander had been forming a posse made up of several cavalrymen, archers, and the Queen's best trackers and their bloodhounds to go after the fugitives should they be needed. Now they were. "I am going to. Damn it, you can't stop me," insisted the stubborn warrior. "But you're hurt," a still concerned Rose retorted. "I said, I am fine. The bleeding has stopped. That coward attacked me when my back was turned. I was too slow to react. He stole my honor. I will have it back." Rose said nothing. "Very well," said Aelin. "You two take the men and go after him. If possible, bring him back alive. Use deadly force only if necessary. Godwyn is already on our fastest ship bound for Durat to inform them of this situation. Rose and I will stay here. This whole city will remain on total lockdown until that man is caught or dead. To have a killer that close to the royal family. I shudder. Now go." "Wait please, Commander. I wish to go with them," a familiar voice called out. Laszlo stepped forward from behind the crowd of soldiers preparing. "Sir, I'd like to go as well. I am pretty good at tracking myself and I would like to help." A hesitant Aelin responded, "I don't know if that is." Gress interjected, "Forgive me, sire, but Sir Laszlo has proven himself to be a very capable warrior on the battlefield. He did help Rose fend off dozens of those Nethergate assassins. We could use someone like him just in case. Razi may be young, but his skills with a blade," he glanced at Robert's wounded arm, "are quite formidable for his age. We could use someone like Sir Laszlo. Better to be safe than sorry, milord." Aelin consented, "Very well, someone get Ambassador Laszlo a horse. But do be careful." Laszlo smiled, "I always am." With that the three men and their posse of trackers, soldiers, and hounds were soon on the trail of Razi and his cohorts. The sound of horns blowing and bloodhounds howling was growing closer. They had found the dead body and were now hot on their trail again. The young cleric knew it would be only a matter of time. They would not make it past the fortress of Durat after all, but he would not go down without a fight. He would kill as many of the Queen's troops as he could before he was killed or captured. Before he left Nagara, Razi had placed an earth rune and fire rune in each hand. The young apprentice figured he would get some use out of them shortly. The four Nagarians arrived at a small stream that fed into the Faetuus River. "We should start heading downstream toward the river and follow it south. If we stay close enough to the river, it should help throw the dogs off our scent a bit and maybe buy us a few more hours," said one of the escorts. The others concurred with his assessment. However, Razi was young and still new at evading and fleeing from a foe. And, maybe, under normal circumstances the plan may have worked. But, these were Queen's knights armed with the finest trackers and hounds in the Quendom. They would not be so easily fooled. At the base of the stream, they stopped for a drink and to catch their breath. After filling up their water flasks, one of the three escorts spoke up. "Do you guys hear that?" "I don't hear anything," said another as he was busy topping off his water supply. The first replied, "Exactly, it's too quiet. What happened to the barking?" Whoosh! Thud, thud, thud. A volley of Falena arrows came raining down upon them. The two escorts in conversation were dead before their bodies had collapsed into the river. The remaining soldier and Razi drew their weapons and started back up slowly up the other side of the river. They heard a voice shout off in the distance, "Loose!" With that a second wave of arrows was heading their way. Using their blades, they managed to dodge and parry several arrows. But, with a third wave now heading their way, both men took cover behind a few trees. Razi quickly using the earth rune casted the canopy defense spell. This powerful protective spell would act as a mystical barrier between them and the archers. Thus, the next wave of arrows was immediately deflected and bounced off the potent magic shield. Standing to their feet, the two men started once more to try and head up the other side of the embankment with the canopy spell guarding their flank. They made it part of the way up the hill when two dark blurs lunged at them in a great speed. They were animals. Both men were instantly knocked to the ground by these snarling beasts. One of the scouts and his two hounds had managed to sneak around them earlier and had now outflanked them. The one hound on the remaining Nagarian escort after leaping onto the man went right for the throat. The ferocious canine with its powerful teeth had severed the man's jugular in seconds. Blood and tissue went flying everywhere. Razi had been a bit quicker than the other. With one hand he managed to protect his throat. Before the dog could chomp down for the death blow, Razi stopped the bite. Luckily, for him, he wore gauntlets around his wrists made of leather and iron. The dog's teeth couldn't pierce the alloy. With his other hand he reached in his side, pulled out a knife, and slashed the dog under his torso. The beast, foaming at the mouth one moment, was dead the next. The arrogant warrior leapt to his feet, a grim look of satisfaction on his face. He raised his left hand immediately, muttered an incantation under his breath, and flames began to appear and wrap themselves around the scout and other dog. Both died from the magical burns instantly. Razi tried to run again, but fell over. Standing back up, he now just noticed the pain in his leg. When the hound had leapt on him, the dog's claws had pierced his skin and left deep gashes in his leg muscles. He couldn't run. Not that it mattered. He could see horses in every direction. He was surrounded. Before the priest could cast his next spell, a familiar voice yelled an incantation and then a blue light appeared all around them. Gress, using his water rune, had used the spell Silent Lake, which temporarily prevents anyone from casting any more spells within its field of effect for a short amount of time. In other words, his earth and fire runes were useless now. Smirking to himself, he removed his sword from its sheath. Good, he thought, he would rather settle this with steel than runes anyhow. For Razi, killing your foe at a distance with magic didn't have the same personal satisfaction as did shoving your sword into someone's chest and watching the life leave their eyes. That is the personal touch, as he liked to call it. Laszlo and the two Queen's Knights dismounted their stallions with weapons drawn and at the ready. Other palace guards did the same. Razi was truly surrounded, his magic was useless, and he was greatly outnumbered. Despite this, his brash ego still would not be hindered. Goading them, he said, "So, at last their mighty Queen's Knights have caught up to little old me. And all these guards just for a Nagarian apprentice? Are your skills as warriors truly so poor? Or maybe, you must really fear me? Or maybe both?" Gress retorted, "You will not provoke us into anger and a conflict so easily. End these games. You're surrounded and wounded. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully, and the Queen still may show you mercy." "Mercy? Ha! Have my head served on a platter, you mean? I spit on your Queen's mercy," said Razi provokingly. He continued, looking over at Robert, who seemed utterly livid by this point. "How about you, old man?" He pointed at Robert, but more specifically at the bandage wound on his arm. "Want to finish what we started this morning? Or does your bandaged up boo-boo hurt too much for you to fight? Or are you too much of a coward to fight against your better Queen's Knight? You fanatical dog, you have no honor!" yelled Robert as he started twirling his halberd above his head and advancing toward the foreign swordsman. Neither Laszlo nor Gress tried to stop him. They knew Robert was beyond reasoning at the moment. He had lost his honor in his own mind, and now he wanted to take it back by force. The best they could do was stand at the ready and be prepared to intervene should things turn south for the older brother. Robert's technique was flawless. Every blow and strike were perfectly executed. Only Razi, despite being injured, younger, and more inexperienced as far as battle and war was concerned, was able to dodge and reflect all of the larger man's attacks. The clanging of the metal upon metal reverberated across the whole forest as every eye was fixated upon these two great warriors. Both men never took their eyes off each other, even as Razi now went on the offensive. The Nagarian rushed at Robert. He dipped and faded left, then like lightning moved right as he was about to reach him and slashed downwards with the sword. Robert parried with his weapon's lower half. The blade clashed against the metal of the halberd with a shriek that sent sparks flying into the air. The swordsman was quick to recover and tried for an uppercut slash in hopes of attempting to catch the Queen's knight off balance. Robert barely managed to shift his weight and stance in time as part of the blow cut some of his loose robe's arm sleeves off. Swinging his long weapon back around at full speed, Robert countered. This took Razi by surprise to be countered against so suddenly. He rolled off to the opposite side, but not before taking off some of the hair off of Nyoka's servant. Had he been a second faster, Robert would have taken the top of his head clean off and not just a few strands of hair. Gress and Laszlo glanced over at each other. They both had the same thought. Despite being older and more experienced in battle, Robert was in trouble against the younger and faster fighter. Another thought, also, entered Gress's mind. This young man's sword technique and fighting style were very familiar to him. Then a new suspicion, rather an old one, entered his mind as he continued to watch his brother fight this foreigner. Now both men got back to their feet and began to circle each other, waiting for the other to make the next move. As disrespected as Robert felt right now, he still knew he would have to do something different. This cocky boy seemed able to read Robert like a book, knowing every move he was about to do. Only by being spontaneous as he had just done was he able to catch him off guard long enough to make a decent move. Glancing over at Laszlo and his brother for a moment, the older knight had an idea. If it had worked for Laszlo that one day, maybe it could work for him too, he thought. Still encircling each other, Razi bellowed, "I am not getting any younger here, old man, and God knows you're not. You going to fight or what? Or do you need that little red-headed skirt to come save you again? Is that it? You need a woman to fight your battles for you? Ha!" Robert stopped circling and began charging him recklessly. His stance and guard were utterly non-existent now. Laszlo and Gress leaped forward knowing this would be it. Razi smiled his smug grin. He knew he had provoked the man into this reckless attack, and that now Razi had him right where he wanted him. With a few more feet to go, the knight did something rather unexpected. He slowed down just long enough to hurl his halberd like a javelin right at the Nagarian. It was so close and he was moving so fast that he took Razi completely by surprise. The smug grin on his face disappeared as he did all he could to move. Razi forced himself to fall on his back and dropped his weapon in the process. It was all he could do to prevent the large weapon from passing right through his chest, like a hot knife through butter. Robert hadn't stopped running until he was on top of the young man. He began to punch him in the face again and again, yelling, "Who's laughing now? You little bastard. Where is that arrogant grin? I'll beat it out of you." Gress, Laszlo, and others ran up to the two fighters. They were physically restraining a cursing Robert from the now bloody-faced and broken-nosed member of the Order of Tessers. Razi was on the verge of passing out, but it mattered not. For he knew in the recesses of his mind, all was going according to plan.